Any one of us, when riding in a car and wanting to go to a specific place, usually can reach that place easily, even if it's new to them. That's because moving on land roads isn't complicated. Roads are paved and clear, with signs and arrows everywhere. And if you get really stuck and don't know where you are, anyone you ask will guide you. But that's on land. In the air, the situation is different. Clouds surround you from every direction. The sky looks the same everywhere, with no roads, no signs, nothing to tell you where you're going or coming from. And you won't find someone up there to stop and ask, "Sorry, I'm not from around here. How do I get to that place?" And this raises a very important question. How do pilots know the way when the sky looks exactly the same? Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our channel, Wonders of Secrets. But before we start, if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell so you get. At the beginning of the last century, after a very long journey of human attempts to invent a means of flying, starting from Albassib and Furness to the Wright brothers, a successful airplane model was finally made in December 1903. After that, planes became an essential part of people's lives. But of course, airplanes back then were very primitive. In those early plane models, pilots used to fly only during the day because they relied mainly on their eyesight to determine directions. What helped them was that planes didn't fly at high altitudes, so the pilot could clearly see everything beneath, whether buildings, rivers, lakes, or other landmarks, and could steer accordingly. As the aircraft industry developed and planes could fly at much higher altitudes, pilots started using tools to help them see better from a distance, like binoculars or a drift indicator, which was essentially a binocular with specific markings on the lens that helped pilots determine wind speed and direction and correct their course, while still visually identifying landmarks on the ground, regardless of altitude. But by the early 1930s, air navigation areas started expanding, and pilots were forced to travel through places with no clear landmarks or distinctive signs, like vast deserts or mountain ranges. So airline companies came up with a very strange idea to draw huge arrows made of concrete in various locations, each arrow measuring tens of meters in length, painted in yellow so pilots could easily see them from the sky. Each group of arrows led to a beacon or control tower in a specific area. At the time, large numbers of these arrows were made across the United States, connecting the East and West, and these huge arrows, by the way, still exist in many places, and you can see them on Google Maps even today. All these navigation methods relied on direct visual sight and on clear, visible landmarks on the ground that one could depend on, which in a way wasn't much different from someone driving a car on land. But of course, things were about to change. Pilots later needed to travel over many areas without arrows, without any landmarks at all, even over vast seas and oceans. And not just that, they also needed to travel at night when everything was dark and at much higher altitudes, literally above the clouds. So it was necessary to find a way to draw a path for them in the air without relying on direct vision. One of the most important tools pilots turned to for solving this problem was the sextant, a device shaped like a protractor that sailors once used to determine their position relative to the North Star at night or the sun during the day. Portuguese pilot Gago Coutinho developed it in 1922 to suit air navigation, enabling pilots to determine their position relative to latitude and longitude lines. Alongside the sextant, they also used calculation methods to determine their location, like dead reckoning, which relied on the time and speed the plane covered during its trip. But of course, all these methods were difficult and complicated and not sufficiently accurate. At this point, it was the perfect time for radio waves to enter aviation and bring about modern air navigation technology. The first major step in the development of air navigation was the appearance of known stations called AN range stations. Massive ground towers, each about 40 meters high, built in a square formation with four towers. Each tower transmitted an encrypted signal in a specific direction through the air, which the pilot received in the cockpit as an audio broadcast. Whenever this broadcast changed in a certain pattern, the pilot immediately knew whether they were on the correct path or not. The audio wave system of these AN towers worked well, but there was one main issue. The frequencies they used were low frequencies, making them prone to interference for any reason. So in the 1950s and 60s, this system was replaced with a better one, the VOR system, which stands for Very High Frequency Omnidirectional Range Station. The advantage of this system was its strong signal over a short range, and what made it superior to any previous system was the way it worked. The ground station transmitted two signals, one fixed and the other rotating 360 degrees from 0 to 360. This meant the plane equipped with a VOR receiver would never lose the signal, as the station kept transmitting continuously. This allowed the pilot to precisely determine their location relative to the station, and thus know their directions without fearing signal loss. That's why the VOR system gained huge popularity and remained in use for many years. In fact, some airplanes still have the VOR system today as a backup for safety. And this brings us to the final stage of air navigation technology: satellites and GPS. The Global Positioning System, known as GPS, was developed for the first time in the 1970s, but wasn't used in civilian planes until the mid-1990s, around 1995. At that time, this system was ingeniously integrated with aircraft, so the pilot wouldn't have to exert any effort in steering the plane. The plane would fly by itself along the desired path, fully autonomously through what's known as autopilot. So basically nowadays, the pilot isn't actually flying the plane throughout the entire trip, as some people believe. He isn't sitting there gripping the plane's steering wheel, swerving right and left. What happens is, before the plane takes off, at the ground operations center, there's a man called the flight dispatcher, or, metaphorically, the ground pilot. This person isn't even on the plane. He's in the ground operations center, drawing up the flight route the plane will follow based on data and information he has. He determines the plane's route, the altitude it will fly at, and all this information is entered into the plane's computer. Using the GPS system, the plane starts moving along this route entirely automatically, without any intervention from the pilot. This is what's known as the autopilot system, meaning the pilot isn't really flying the plane. The pilot's only job in the cockpit is to monitor the autopilot and track the data in front of him continuously to ensure the system is functioning properly. At the same time, he must be ready to intervene in case of emergency situations or technical malfunctions. In such cases, the pilot disables the autopilot and takes manual control of the plane. Also, if ground control contacts the pilot to inform him of an incoming storm or difficult weather conditions, the pilot then disables the autopilot and manually adjusts the plane's course away from problem areas. Of course, during takeoff and landing, the pilot is the one who handles both. That's why pilots often compete among themselves over who can perform the smoothest takeoffs and landings, so passengers don't feel any jolts and the flight feels perfectly smooth. This process in particular is what distinguishes a professional pilot from an amateur one. So the actual answer to the question isn't, how does a pilot know the way when the sky looks the same? That's it. We're done. Who made it this far? Everyone who did. You're the best. Leave us a like before you go so we know how many reached the end. And don't forget, if you have any questions that confuse you, write them in the comments under the video so we can answer them. Goodbye.